She moves like a shadow learns to. She sees a goblet shimmer wrong. She knows poison the way wolves know rain. Before it falls, she knocks. She doesn't think. She just knocks the cup aside. The king reaches for the wrong one. He drinks to prove the wine is safe. He drinks the death meant for her. He falls like a felled oak, and the hall stops breathing. He survives. Barely. But something else wakes in him, older than the poison, deeper than the pain. He says she is his mate. He says he always knew. The court says she is his killer. And Dovey, invisible Dovey, the woman no one has ever looked at twice, must decide if the man clawing toward her is in love, or only dying slowly, and dragging her down with him. So tell me, when the most dangerous man in the realm finally sees you, is it devotion, or is it the poison still talking? The candlelight in the great hall of Valethorn always pooled thickest near the dais, as if even the flames knew better than to stray too far from the king's table. And Dovey had spent 6 years learning to live just outside that glow. She liked it there. The dim was kind to her. Nobody troubled a woman they couldn't quite see. Tonight the hall was a forest of silk and ambition. 300 nobles packed shoulder to shoulder beneath banners that did not belong to her house, drinking wine she had not been offered, laughing at jokes she had not been told. House Mavros holding court at the king's right hand, House Calder pressing close on his left, and far down the second table, past the salt, past the candied figs nobody important touched, sat Dovey of House Belrose, a house so minor it barely warranted ink in the genealogies. A woman so unremarkable the serving girls forgot to refill her cup twice in 1 hour and never once apologized. She didn't mind. Truly, she didn't. Unremarkable had kept her safe since she was 18 years old, and had learned, in one terrible season, exactly what happened to noble women who got noticed by the wrong sort of man. She had perfected the art of being furniture. A woman who watched everything and said nothing, who memorized exits before she memorized names, who could tell you which lord drank too fast and which lady's smile never touched her eyes, and who nobody, not once, had ever thought to ask. She was watching King Idris now. Everyone was, in their own slanted way, the way you watch a storm cloud you hope passes over your house and onto someone else's. He was magnificent in the way storms were magnificent. You admired it from a safe distance and thanked every god you knew that it wasn't coming for you. 31 years old and built like something that had been carved rather than born. All long lines and restrained power. Dark hair pushed back from a face that women 3 tables over kept finding excuses to glance at. He wore the crown the way other men wore a habit, like it had simply always been there, like he'd forgotten it was even on his head. He did not look bored, exactly. He looked the way wolves looked when they were thinking of somewhere else entirely, his amber eyes, and they were, unmistakably, the eyes of his wolf even in this skin. Gold-flecked and far too old for 31 winters, moved over the hall without landing on anything. A king performing the part of king while some other part of him paced a cage somewhere far away. Dovey had noticed that about him months ago. Nobody else seemed to. She noticed things. It was the one talent her plainness had bought her. When nobody looks at you, you are free to look at everything else. And Dovey looked at everything. She'd noticed the way Lord Phineas of House Calder smiled with his mouth a half-second before his eyes caught up, like a man rehearsing a kindness he didn't feel. She'd noticed how he always positioned himself near the wine service when matters of succession came up. She'd noticed, 3 weeks ago, the way he'd looked at the king during the border treaty vote, not with the irritation of a man who'd lost an argument, but with the patience of a man recalculating. She'd told her cousin Wren about it once, in a quiet corridor, and Wren had laughed, not unkindly, just the way you laugh at a child who insists the shadows under the bed are alive. "You see ghosts in candle smoke, Dovey," she'd said. "Phineas smiles like that at everyone. It's just his face." Maybe it was. Dovey had learned not to argue when nobody believed her. Arguing only made people remember you existed. And then they remembered all the other strange, watchful things about you, too. And then you were not furniture anymore. You were the odd cousin. The one who counted exits. So she'd said nothing. She'd gone back to her wine and her invisibility and let the matter sink beneath the surface of her mind, like a stone dropped into still water. But tonight Lord Phineas was standing too close to the wine service again, and his mouth was doing that thing, that rehearsed half-smile that arrived before the feeling did, and Dovey's whole body went tight with a wrongness she couldn't yet name. She watched a servant, young, nervous, hands trembling just slightly around a silver tray, carry 2 goblets toward the dais, one for the king. One, she would learn later, was never meant to leave that tray at all, except that it had to look like an accident, like simple confusion between 2 near-identical cups. The servant's hands shook harder as he neared the king's table. Dovey saw why. She saw the faint sheen on the rim of the goblet on the left, the one drifting, slow and deliberate, toward the king's waiting hand. A film, oily and near invisible, the kind of thing you'd only catch if you'd spent your whole life learning to see what others overlooked. She saw the tremor that ran up the servant's arm, the way his throat worked like he might be sick, the way to see his eyes, when they flicked. Just once, toward Lord Phineas, held the particular terror of a man being forced to do something he could not refuse. She understood it all in the space of one held breath. The wine was poisoned, the servant had no choice in carrying it, and in 3 seconds the King of Valethorn was going to lift that goblet to his mouth, in front of 300 witnesses and die. There wasn't time to call out. There wasn't time to be believed even if she did. She was Dovey of House Belrose, the unremarkable, the furniture, the woman nobody listened to even when she was right. Calling out would buy her a heartbeat of confused stares and nothing more. The king would already be drinking by the time anyone decided whether to take her seriously. So she didn't call out. She moved. It was not graceful. It was not noble. It was the same animal instinct that makes a body flinch from fire before the mind has named the flame. Her hand simply moved, fast and low and unthinking, and she knocked the poisoned goblet from the servant's tray a half-second before it reached the king's fingers. The cup spun once in the candlelight, a bright, wet arc of red, and shattered against the stone floor in a sound that seemed, for one suspended instant, louder than every voice in the hall combined. And then everything happened too fast and far too slow at once. The king's hand, already extended, already expecting weight against his palm, closed instead around the second goblet, the safe one, untouched, ordinary, because in the half-second of commotion, in the spinning chaos of shattering glass and gasping nobles, the servant had panicked and shoved the only cup he had left into the king's reach, terrified of arriving at the dais empty-handed. Dovey opened her mouth. No. Wait. But King Idris, the Alpha King of Valethorn, looked down at the broken glass on his floor, looked up at 300 nobles, gone suddenly, dangerously silent, and understood, wrongly, catastrophically, that someone believed his wine was unsafe. A king could not show fear at his own table. A king especially could not show fear of poison, not with every hungry house in the realm watching for the first sign of weakness in his reign. So Idris did the only thing his pride and his crown would allow. He smiled, slow and unbothered, lifted the second goblet to the room as if toasting his own continued health, and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall, "It seems someone fears my wine is foul." His amber eyes swept the tables once, daring any of them to admit it. Let me put the rumor to rest, and he drank. Dovey's whole body screamed, wrong cup, that's the wrong one," but no sound came out. Because in that single heartbeat, she understood with horrible clarity that she had knocked the poison away from his hand only to watch him reach. Of his own choosing, for the one goblet meant to kill someone else entirely. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened. The king lowered the cup. He studied the silence of the hall, faintly amused by what he no doubt thought was overcautious court paranoia. Then his fingers spasmed around the goblet's stem. It fell. Lord Idris, Alpha King of Valethorn, descendant of the first wolf, the man who had never once shown the court a single crack in his armor, made a sound low in his throat that was not human at all. A wolf's whine, raw and startled, bleeding out through a man's mouth, and went down hard against the edge of his own table before he hit the floor. The hall did not gasp, it screamed. 300 nobles surged to their feet at once, chairs scraping, wine spilling, a wall of silk and panic crashing toward the dais. And somewhere in the chaos a woman was shrieking for the royal physician, and a man was shouting for the guard. And Lord Phineas of House Calder stood very still at the edge of the wine service, with his hands folded behind his back and his face arranged expertly into the precise shape of horror. Dovey did not move toward the noise. She moved toward the king. She didn't decide to. Her body simply went, cutting low and fast through the press of skirts and boots, dropping to her knees on the cold stone beside a man twice her rank and 3 times her danger, because some animal part of her, the part that had knocked the cup, the part that saw what others couldn't, refused to let him die alone on a floor surrounded by people too important to kneel. His eyes were open, barely. The amber of them had gone strange, the pupils blown impossibly wide, swallowing nearly all the gold, black and bottomless and fixed, with a terrible, unblinking intensity on her face. His lips were already going gray. His big body, the body of an alpha, who could level a charging bull elk with one blow, shuddered like something far smaller and far more breakable. "Hold on," Dovey whispered, not even sure he could hear her, not even sure why she was the one whispering it. "Hold on, please." His hand, shaking violently, fingers curling against the agony, tearing through him, found her wrist. His grip was weak. It was also, somehow, the most certain thing she had ever felt. "You," he rasped, blood-flecked foam at the corner of his mouth, his ruined voice barely a thread of sound. "Mine." And then his eyes rolled back, and the Alpha King of Valethorn went still on the floor of his own banquet hall, while Dovey of House Belrose knelt over him with his blood cooling under her knees, and the entire court of Valethorn beginning, in one collective and terrible breath, to wonder exactly what she had done. The physicians worked on him through the night, in a sick room that smelled of bitter herbs and candle wax, and, underneath it all, the copper tang of a king's blood. Dovey was not permitted inside. She was not, strictly speaking, permitted anywhere. 2 guardsmen had simply appeared at her elbows in the chaos after the king fell and steered her, not ungently but not gently either, into a small antechamber off the main hall, where she had sat for 4 hours on a hard wooden bench while the candles burned down and her own hand shook in her lap. Nobody spoke to her. Nobody needed to. She could read the room the way she read everything. The guard's careful refusal to meet her eyes. The way servants hurrying past slowed just slightly when they passed the open door, just to look, just to see the woman who'd thrown the cup. She heard them in the hall outside, voices pitched low but not low enough. She struck it from his hand herself. I saw it, right before his eyes. They say the wine had nothing in it until she touched the goblet. Belrose. Who even is Belrose? Nobody from nowhere, suddenly close enough to poison a king. The words landed like small, precise blows. Dovey sat very still and let them land, because arguing back from inside a guarded antechamber at 3 a.m. would convince exactly no one, and because some old, exhausted part of her recognized the shape of this moment. She had spent 6 years making herself invisible to avoid being noticed by the wrong kind of attention. She had never once considered that visibility might find her anyway, dressed as an accusation instead of a danger. Lord Phineas arrived sometime near dawn, golden-haired and grave-faced and radiating exactly the right measure of concern, the kind a man wears like a well-tailored coat. He paused at the antechamber door, looked at Dovey with an expression of careful, performed sympathy and said, "Such a terrible thing to have witnessed, my lady. I do hope the guard is treating you kindly. No one believes, truly, that a woman of your standing would have the wit to plan such a thing alone. It was, on its surface, almost kind. Dovey heard the knife folded inside it. No one believes you could have done it alone. Already planting the next question in every listening ear. Then who helped her? She said nothing. She had learned, a long time ago, that the women who argued were the women remembered as guilty, and the women who stayed quiet were sometimes, allowed to simply fade back into the furniture where they belonged. But this time, fading didn't come. This time, for the first time in 6 years of careful invisibility, the entire court of Valethorn was looking directly at her, and no amount of stillness was going to make her disappear. He woke 3 days later, and the first word out of his mouth was her name. Dovey was not there to hear it. She'd learned that detail secondhand from a chambermaid too frightened of her own gossip to keep it to herself, whispered while refilling Dovey's water basin in the small guest chamber, where she'd been quietly, politely, unmistakably confined since the banquet. He woke shouting for you, my lady. Wouldn't settle till the physician sent for you. The guards are coming. They came within the hour. Not arrested, exactly. Nobody used that word, but escorted, with a courtesy so rigid it might as well have been chains. Through corridors that had gone utterly silent at her passing, past nobles who stopped their conversations to watch her go by and resumed them, lower, the instant she'd passed. The king's sick room was dim, the shutters drawn against a sun that seemed too cruel for what lay inside. He was propped against a mountain of pillows, bare-chested beneath a loose linen wrap, and even half dead he was enormous in that bed. Too large for the room, too large for the illness that had nearly killed him. His skin had gone the gray-white of old ash. There were physicians clustered at the foot of the bed, and royal guard at every door, and somewhere among them stood a court healer wringing her hands. And none of it mattered, at all the moment. Idris's eyes found Dovey's across the room. They were still wrong. That was the first thing she noticed. The thing that would stay wrong for weeks. His pupils, even in the dim afternoon light, slanting through the gap in the shutters, were blown nearly black, swallowing the amber almost entirely, fixed and dilated in a way no healthy eye ever was. The poison had done that. The physicians murmured it might never fully correct, a small, permanent mark left behind by the thing that should have killed him. "You're hurt," he said. His voice was wrecked, sandpaper-roo, but it cut through the room like the only sound that mattered. "Are you hurt? Did anyone touch you?" "Did anyone?" "I'm fine," Dovey said, startled into honesty by the sheer naked urgency of it. "My Lord King, you nearly died, and your first question is whether I'm hurt." "Yes," he said. As if this should have been obvious, as if there were no other question in the world worth asking. He tried to sit further upright, and one of the physicians made a strangled noise of protest that he ignored entirely. "Come here, my lord." "Please." The word cracked something open in the room. Dovey heard the small, scandalized silence of the gathered physicians, the way the captain of the guard near the door shifted his weight, the unmistakable sound of a king who did not beg, begging. She crossed the room because there was, in the end, no version of this moment in which she didn't. His hand found hers, the instant she was close enough, fingers wrapping around her wrist, with a grip that should have been weak after 3 days unconscious, and was instead fierce, almost desperate, as if letting go might unmake something vital. "You knocked it from my hand," he said low, only for her. "I saw you. I saw you see it before any of them did. I knocked it from the servant's tray." Dovey said carefully. "Not from your hand, my lord. You drank the other cup yourself." "Because I am a fool," he said, with a sudden flash of something almost like wry self-loathing beneath the wreckage of his voice, who could not stand to look weak in front of 300 vultures. "You tried to save me, and I drank the poison anyway out of pure stubborn pride. And you," his thumb moved over the inside of her wrist, slow, like he was memorizing the pulse there. "You stayed. On the floor. Everyone else ran for the physicians and you stayed. Someone had to, Dovey said. Why you? It was the question the whole court was asking, in far uglier words, but coming from him it didn't sound like accusation. It sounded like wonder. I don't know, she admitted. I've never known why I notice things. I only know that I do. He studied her face for a long moment. Too long, longer than was comfortable, the way a starving man studies bread. His grip on her wrist tightened, fractionally. And Dovey felt something stir low in her stomach. Unbidden and unwanted, a heat that had no business existing between a half-dead king and a woman the court already suspected of trying to kill him. I knew you, Idris said quietly. Before. The moment you knocked that cup. Before the poison even touched my tongue. Something in me already knew you. My wolf was already moving towards you across that hall before I understood why. Dovey's pulse stumbled. That isn't possible, she said. We've never spoken, my lord. I've been at 3 of your father's banquets and 2 of yours, and you've never once looked at me. I know, Idris said, and something raw moved across his ruined, ash-pale face. I know, and I cannot explain it to myself either, except that I woke up 3 days ago with your name already in my mouth, and a hole in my chest shaped exactly like you, and I have not been able to stop thinking it since. His blown, too dark eyes held hers, unblinking, terrifyingly sincere. You are my mate, Dovey of House Belrose. I do not know how I went 31 years without knowing it, but I know it now the way I know my own name. The physicians behind him went very, very still. Dovey felt the floor of her careful, invisible life tilt sideways beneath her feet. My lord, she said, as gently as she could manage with her heart slamming against her ribs. You have been poisoned. You are not yourself. I have never been more myself, Idris said, and the terrible, unguarded certainty in his wrecked voice frightened her far more than any accusation the court could have leveled at her. The physician's verdict, delivered to the king's council the following morning in low, careful tones, was this: the poison. A rare compound, slow-acting, designed to mimic natural failure of the heart, had very nearly killed him. That he had survived at all was, in the physician's careful words, a mercy none of us can explain. That his pupils remained unnaturally dilated was a lingering effect they could not predict the end of. And that the sudden, fervent, all-consuming fixation the king had developed upon the Lady Dovey of House Belrose, in the days since waking, was, almost certainly, some side effect of the poison, working strangely upon a mind already primed by his wolf's instincts, a delusion of bonding, brought on by trauma and chemistry rather than truth. It was a tidy explanation. It satisfied the council. It satisfied, Dovey suspected, everyone except the king himself, who received the verdict with a flat, unmoved stare and said only, "Then I am poisoned for the rest of my life, because this will not fade." It did not satisfy the court, either. Not the part of the court that mattered. The houses circling the throne like wolves around a wounded stag, scenting weakness and opportunity in equal measure. Within a week, the whispers had calcified into something close to consensus. The king had been poisoned at a banquet by a woman of no consequence, and that same woman of no consequence had somehow, through poison, through witchcraft, through some scheme too clever for her plain face to suggest, bent the king's mind to her will in the same stroke. She poisoned him and bewitched him both. Dovey overheard a baroness murmur to her companion outside the council chamber, "Clever girl," to make herself indispensable to the very man she tried to kill. It would have been almost funny, the sheer impossibility of being simultaneously the assassin and the prize, except that Dovey understood with growing dread exactly how this story would end if she let the court write it without her. A woman blamed for poisoning a king did not survive long enough to grow old in her invisibility. She survived exactly as long as it took the right lord to convince the right council that justice required a body. Lord Phineas, predictably, was the loudest advocate for a swift and thorough investigation, voice steeped in concern, eyes steeped in something colder. For the king's own safety, he said again and again, in council chambers and corridors and the ears of every house that mattered, we must be certain the Lady Belrose poses no further threat. I say this with great reluctance, you understand. I have nothing against the girl personally. Dovey, listening from the edge of rooms she was technically permitted to occupy and practically forbidden to speak in, thought. That is exactly the lie of a man who has everything against me, and is far too careful to say so where it can be traced back to him. It was Idris, in the end, who solved the immediate problem of her safety, though Dovey would spend a great deal of the following weeks deciding whether his solution constituted rescue or a different, more intimate sort of cage. She remains under my protection, he announced to the full council, 3 days after waking, still pale, still wrong-eyed, but upright now, and terrifyingly, unmistakably the king again in every line of his bearing. Until this matter of poison is resolved, the Lady Dovey will reside within the royal wing, under guard, at my side. If she is guilty, she will be watched every hour of every day until proven so. If she is innocent, his eyes had found Dovey's across the chamber, and something in his ruined, blown-pupilled gaze had gone fierce and absolute. Then no one in this quartet will lay a hand on her while I yet breathe. It was framed, carefully as caution, as prudence, as a king's reasonable instinct to keep a suspect close until the truth could be sifted from the lies. Nobody in that chamber believed for a single moment that caution was the king's true motive, and least of all Dovey, who understood, with the particular, sinking clarity of a woman who had spent her whole life avoiding exactly this kind of attention, that she had just been bound by royal decree to the one man in the realm capable of unmaking her entire careful, invisible existence with nothing more than the way he looked at her. The royal wing was a different country from the rest of the palace. Quieter, richer, hushed in the particular way that only proximity to absolute power could hush a place. Dovey's new chamber adjoined the king's own by a single connecting door that the guards, with grim and obvious discomfort, left unlocked at his explicit command. She did not sleep well those first nights. Not from fear, exactly, though there was fear, plenty of it, coiled tight in her chest every time she thought of Lord Phineas's careful, patient smile. It was something else keeping her awake, something low and persistent and entirely unwelcome. The awareness, even through stone walls, of exactly where in the adjoining room the king lay, exactly how far away his breathing was, exactly how the air itself seemed to hum faintly whenever he was near. She told herself it was nerves. She told herself, lying rigid and wide-eyed in an unfamiliar bed in a wing built for people far grander than her, that this was simply what fear felt like when it had nowhere left to go. She was lying to herself, and some small, exhausted part of her knew it. Idris did not stay away from her, even confined to convalescence by physicians who clearly wanted to chain him to his bed and lacked the rank to enforce it. He found reasons, endless, transparent, almost charming in their flimsiness, to summon her. Would she review the council's account of the banquet seating, since she'd noticed things others hadn't? Would she sit with him while the physician changed his dressings, since his hands shook too badly to hold still otherwise, which was, Dovey suspected, an outright lie, given how steady those same hands were when they reached for her? Would she simply stay? Just a little longer. Just until the ache in his chest eased, which it never seemed to, not until she was close enough to touch. He touched her constantly, not improperly, never that. Even half-mad with whatever the poison had cracked open in him, he never once crossed a line she hadn't silently invited, but persistently, compulsively, the way a man touches a wound to confirm it's still there. A hand at the small of her back when she rose to leave, fingers brushing hers when she passed him a cup. Once, exhausted past his own pride's tolerance, he'd simply rested his forehead against her shoulder for the length of 10 breaths while a council scribe pretended very hard not to notice. And Dovey had sat frozen and burning and had not, despite every careful instinct screaming at her to pull away, pulled away. "You smell like rain before it falls," he told her once, low, his face buried against her hair while she sat beside his sickbed reading him reports he didn't actually need read aloud. "I don't know how else to say it. Cool and green, and like something about to change." "That's a strange thing to say to a woman half the court thinks tried to murder you," Dovey said, more breathless than she intended. "The court is wrong about a great many things," Idris murmured, "and right about exactly one, which is that I am undone the moment you're in the room." She should have pulled away from that. She thought about it. Genuinely thought about extracting her hand from his, putting the careful, safe distance back between them that 6 years of practiced invisibility had taught her to maintain. But his thumb was tracing slow, absent circles against her knuckles, and his breathing had gone deep and even against her shoulder, for the first time since he'd woken from the poison, and some traitorous, long-starved part of her did not want to be the one to end it. "Is it real?" she asked him quietly, the question she'd been circling for days without daring to land on it directly. "Or is it the poison talking? Because I need to know which one I'm," she faltered. "Which one I'm allowing." He lifted his head, looked at her with those terrible, beautiful, irreversibly altered eyes. Pupils still blown too wide, still marked with whatever the poison had torn open in him, and said, with a steadiness that unsettled her more than any wild claim could have, "I don't know yet either. I only know that I have wanted nothing in 31 years the way I want to keep you near me now, and I intend to spend as long as it takes proving to you it isn't the poison. Even if it takes years. Even if you never quite believe me until it's done." It was, Dovey thought, the most honest answer he could have given her. It was also, infuriatingly, not a no. She found the servant boy 3 days after the council meeting, hiding. Or trying to, with the kind of clumsy desperation that only made him easier to find. In the lower stores near the kitchens, where he'd been assigned to scullery work after the banquet, demoted from table service and treated by the rest of the staff like a man already condemned. His name was Tam. He was younger than Dovey had realized in the panicked chaos of that night, perhaps 16, with the kind of thin, wary face that came from a childhood spent never having quite enough. He flinched so violently when she found him alone among the wine casks that he nearly upended an entire crate. "Please," he said, before she'd said a single word, dropping to his knees on the cold stone floor with a speed that suggested he'd been expecting this confrontation for days. "Please, my lady, I didn't know. I swear before every god I didn't know what was in that cup. He told me it was only a jest, a harmless thing to startle the king. He said if I didn't carry it, my whole family would." His voice broke entirely. "Please don't tell the guard. Please. I have a mother and 2 sisters in the lower town. They'll starve without my wage. Please. I'll do anything." "Who told you?" Dovey asked, though she already knew, had known since the moment she'd seen the boy's trembling hands and the particular angle of his terrified glance toward the wine serves that night. "I can't say his name," Tam whispered, eyes wide with a fear that went bone deep. "He'd said if I ever said his name, he'd see my whole family in the ground before the week was out. My lady, please. I only carried the tray. I didn't choose which cup went where. I only did what I was told." Dovey knelt down in front of him, ignoring the cold press of stone through her skirts until they were eye to eye. "I'm not going to tell the guard," she said. The boy's whole body sagged with a relief so total it was almost painful to witness. "I know it was Vanessa," Dovey continued gently, watching the flicker of pure terror cross Tam's face at the unspoken confirmation. "I'm not asking you to say it. I'm telling you I already know, and that I understand exactly what it costs a person like you to refuse a man like him." She thought of her own 6 careful years of silence, of every instinct she'd swallowed rather than risk the wrong kind of attention. And something in her chest ached with a recognition too sharp to be anything but kinship. You did the only thing you could to keep your family safe. I'm not going to be the reason that safety costs you anything more. Tam stared at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. He was only slowly beginning to translate. You're not going to make me tell them? The council? They've been asking everyone who served that night. They'll come for me eventually, my lady, and if I don't say something. Then when they come, Dovey said, you may tell them you carried a tray and do not know how the cup was poisoned. That much is true. The rest of it is mine to carry, not yours. It was a small mercy. It cost her nothing she could spare and gave the boy everything he had left to lose. But Dovey understood in the quiet of that wine cellar that this, small mercies extended to people too powerless to ask for them, was the only kind of justice that had ever once been offered to her, and she would not be the one to withhold it from someone smaller and more frightened than herself. She left Tam still kneeling among the casks and walked back up into the palace's golden, indifferent light, carrying one piece of confirmed knowledge that she could not yet prove to a single living soul who mattered. The trouble with knowing something the entire court refused to believe was that knowledge, unaccompanied by proof, curdled into something almost identical to madness. Dovey had spent her whole life being right about quiet, unimportant things. Which lord watered his wine? Which lady's marriage was a careful performance? Which servant was stealing candle stubs to sell in the lower town? And being right about quiet things had never once mattered, because nobody had ever needed her to be believed before. Now she needed it desperately, and the more she insisted, gently, carefully, to anyone who would half listen, that Lord Phineas bore looking into, the more she sounded, even to her own ears, exactly like a guilty woman trying to cast suspicion elsewhere. You understand, said the king's seneschal, an old, careful man named Master Orin, who at least had the grace to look apologetic as he said it, that an accusation against a house as powerful as Calder, made by a woman currently under suspicion herself, will be read by this entire court as precisely the kind of desperate misdirection a guilty party would attempt. I know how it sounds, Dovey said. Then you understand why I cannot bring it before the council without more than your word. She did understand. That was the cruelest part. She had spent so many years training herself to be unremarkable that now, when it mattered more than it ever had, her unremarkable word weighed nothing at all against a lord's polished reputation. It was Idris, 3 nights later, who finally asked her the question nobody else had thought to ask. They were in his solar, late. The fire burned down to embers. His physicians finally satisfied enough with his recovery to stop hovering at every door. He'd been quieter than usual that evening, watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with the poison and everything to do, Dovey was beginning to suspect, with whatever genuinely lived beneath it. Why you, he said, finally, into the firelit quiet. Not the council's question. Who poisoned the wine? I mean, why you, specifically? Phineas had 100 opportunities to poison me alone, without an audience, without a servant boy who might break under questioning, without the risk of a witness knocking the cup away before it ever reached my hand. Why stage it at a banquet at all, in front of 300 people, with so much room for it to go wrong? Dovey opened her mouth to say she didn't know, and then stopped, because some slow, cold understanding was assembling itself in the back of her mind for the first time, piece by piece, like a puzzle she'd been staring at upside down. Unless it wasn't staged for you at all, she said slowly. Unless the king was never meant to drink it. Idris went very still. Say that again. The servant boy, Dovey said, her heart beginning to pound as the pieces locked into place, was told to carry 2 cups, one safe, one poisoned, and he was positioned. I remember it now. I remember exactly where he stood, closer to the second table than the dais, closer to me. She stared at Idris, the fire throwing strange shadows across his 2 dark eyes. What if the poisoned cup was never meant to reach you at all, my lord? What if it was meant to reach me, and I only noticed it because I was the one meant to drink it, and some part of me recognized the danger before my mind had even named it as danger. Because it was mine. And the moment I knocked it away, the wrong cup ended up in your hand by pure, terrible accident. The fire cracked in the silence that followed. Idris's face had gone through several expressions in the span of a few seconds. Confusion, disbelief, and then something far colder and more focused. The look of a king's mind beginning finally to work the problem rather than simply feel its weight. If that's true, he said slowly, then the poison was never aimed at the throne at all. It was aimed at you, which means someone wanted you dead specifically, badly enough to risk poisoning a king by accident rather than fail to kill you on purpose. His jaw tightened. Which means I did not simply drink poison meant for the crown that night, Dovey. I drank poison meant for my mate. We don't know that I'm your. We will set that argument aside for the moment, Idris said, with a flicker of dark, humorless amusement that did not reach his eyes, because right now I find I am considerably more interested in why an entire house of this court wants a quiet, harmless lesser noblewoman dead badly enough to risk killing their own king by mistake. Dovey's mind raced backward, through weeks of half-noticed details she dismissed as nothing, searching for the one she'd actually been meant to see, and then, with the particular vertigo of a memory finally surfacing whole, she found it. The treaty room, she said. 3 weeks before the banquet, I was delivering correspondence for my aunt. A small errand, nothing important. I wasn't meant to be in that wing at all. I only took a wrong corridor by mistake. Her pulse climbed as the memory sharpened, detail by detail, the way every overlooked thing eventually did, given enough patient attention. Lord Phineas was in the antechamber outside the council room. He was not alone. There was a courier with him, a man I didn't recognize, dressed for hard travel, mud still on his boots from the road. I only caught a few words before I realized I shouldn't be hearing them and turned back the way I'd come. Something about. She closed her eyes, reaching for it. Something about the western passes. Something about the Ashford claim being settled before the king's wedding could complicate it. Idris's expression had gone utterly, dangerously flat. The Ashford claim, he said quietly, is a contested inheritance dispute that has sat unresolved in this court for 11 years, over land that borders House Calder's western estates. Phineas has petitioned 3 separate times to have it settled in his family's favor. The council has refused him 3 separate times, on the grounds that the rightful claim belongs to a branch of the Ashford line that died out, supposedly, without an heir. Supposedly, Dovey echoed. If there were an heir, Idris said slowly, the pieces assembling themselves in his own mind now, faster than she could follow, alive and unaccounted for, and Phineas knew where to find them before the council did. He could control whether that heir was ever found at all, Dovey finished. Or whether they conveniently disappeared before anyone thought to look. She hadn't, until that exact moment, ever once considered the possibility that the unremarkable, half-forgotten lineage of House Belrose, a house so minor it scarcely warranted a footnote, a name nobody important had ever thought worth tracing, might connect, by some buried thread of inheritance neither she nor anyone else had ever bothered to follow, to a contested western estate worth a fortune to the man who controlled it. She had spent 6 years making herself invisible to survive. It had never once occurred to her that the thing making her dangerous to Lord Phineas might be a truth she didn't even know about herself. It took 4 days of careful, quiet digging. Idris's seneschal finally convinced, by the weight of the king's own suspicion rather than Dovey's unsupported word, to pull dusty inheritance ledgers from the deepest archive vaults, to confirm what some patient, long-buried instinct in Dovey had already half known. Her grandmother, it turned out, had been born Lyse Ashford before she married into the minor, unremarkable house of Belrose for love rather than advantage, and had spent the rest of her life quietly, deliberately scrubbing every trace of that more dangerous, more contested name from her descendants' records. Not out of shame, the old ledgers suggested, but out of fear. A note in her own hand, brittle with age, tucked into the back of a property record nobody had opened in decades, read simply, "Better the family is forgotten than fought over. Let them never know what they could have claimed. Safety is worth more than land." Dovey sat with that note for a long time in the quiet of the archive room, feeling something complicated and aching move through her chest. Her grandmother had understood, generations before Dovey ever learned it for herself, that visibility was its own kind of danger, that the safest thing a vulnerable woman could do with a valuable name was bury it so deep nobody ever thought to dig. It had worked for 2 generations. It had stopped working the moment Lord Phineas's careful, ambitious research finally unearthed what lies Ashford had spent her whole life trying to hide. "He must have found the connection months ago," Idris said, reading over the ledger beside her, his shoulder pressed warm and solid against hers in a way that had stopped, somewhere in the last few days, feeling strange to either of them. Long enough to plan something that looked like an accident. A quiet death for an unremarkable woman nobody would think to investigate too closely until I drank from the wrong cup and turned a forgettable tragedy into the poisoning of a king. "He must be furious," Dovey said quietly. "Everything he planned to do quietly, he now has to do in front of the entire court, with you watching." "Good," Idris said, low and rough. "Let him be furious. A frightened man makes mistakes. A patient one almost got away with murdering my mate twice over, once by poison, and once by letting the court believe she'd done it herself." Dovey turned to look at him and found him already watching her, his ruined, 2 dark eyes steady and certain in a way that no longer felt entirely like delusion. "You said mate again," she said softly. "Easily. Like you've stopped wondering whether it's true." "I stopped wondering 3 nights ago," Idris admitted, reaching to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, with a gentleness that did not match the size or the danger of his hands at all. "Watching you work out, piece by piece, alone and unbelieved, the very thing an entire council of trained advisors couldn't see. My wolf knew you the moment you moved across that hall, before either of us understood why. The poison didn't create what I feel for you, Dovey. I think it only burned away whatever wall had been keeping me from noticing it. That's a very convenient thing for a poisoned king to believe," Dovey said, but her voice had lost its earlier edge, gone soft and uncertain instead. "Then let me prove it the inconvenient way," Idris said. "Let the poison fade entirely from my blood. Let my eyes go back to whatever they were before, and watch whether what I feel for you fades with it. If it's only chemistry, time will unmake it. If it's real," he took her hand, pressed it flat against his chest, over the slow, steady drum of his heart, "then it will still be here long after the poison is gone. I am asking you to wait and see, not because I doubt it, but because I understand why you would." It was, Dovey thought, the first time anyone in her entire life had offered to prove themselves to her rather than simply asking to be believed. She should have known peace, even uncertain peace, would not be allowed to last. It came apart on a gray morning 11 days later, when Lord Phineas, cornered now, the noose of evidence tightening around him faster than he could spin new explanations. The council finally, belatedly beginning to ask the questions Dovey had been asking all along, made his last, desperate move not against the king, but against her. She had gone against the explicit and increasingly furious objections of every guard assigned to her to visit her aunt's modest townhouse in the lower noble district. A small act of stubborn normalcy, a single hour of pretending her life had not been entirely upended, taken under heavier guard than she'd wanted but lighter than Idris would have preferred. It was on the narrow street outside that house, in the gray hour before dusk, that 2 men in unmarked livery closed in around her, with the particular, practiced efficiency of men who had done this kind of work before. Dovey saw it coming a half-second before it happened. The same way she'd seen the poison coming across a crowded hall, some old, exhausted instinct screaming a warning. Her conscious mind only caught up to afterward. She managed one sharp cry before a gloved hand closed over her mouth, and a second arm wrenched her backward off her feet, the street tilting sideways, her aunt's lit window receding into the gathering dark. What saved her, what would be spoken of in low, awed tones across the court for months afterward, was not her own quick thinking this time, nor any guard's timely intervention. It was a howl. It tore through the gray dusk from somewhere beyond the rooftops, raw and furious, and utterly unlike the controlled, courtly bearing the king wore in council chambers. The sound of something ancient and possessive and, for one terrible heartbeat, entirely beyond reason. Dovey felt it in her chest before she consciously registered it as sound, a vibration that seemed to come from inside her own ribs rather than from outside them, and the two men holding her went rigid with a fear that had nothing to do with the guards now sprinting up the street. The king's wolf form broke over the rooftop's edge a moment later, enormous, black-furred, eyes blazing that same unnatural, too dilated dark even in beast shape, and Dovey understood in the single suspended second before he hit the ground that this was not a king's careful, measured authority arriving to handle a crisis. This was a mate arriving to retrieve what had been taken from him, and there was nothing careful about it at all. He did not so much as glance at the two men before they fled, wisely, given the low, continuous growl rolling out of his enormous chest, a sound with no patience left in it whatsoever. He came straight for Dovey instead, shifting back to human form in one fluid, brutal motion before he'd even fully stopped moving, and gathered her against his bare chest with both arms shaking, his face buried in her hair, breathing her in like a man surfacing from drowning. "I felt it," he said, voice cracked open and raw against her temple. "The bond? I felt something wrench in my chest the moment they touched you, before I even heard you cry out. I was 3 streets away, and I felt it." His arms tightened, careful even in their desperation not to crush her, every line of his huge body trembling with an adrenaline that had nowhere left to go. "Don't tell me that's the poison talking. Don't you dare tell me that's the poison." Dovey, shaking nearly as badly as he was, pressed her face into his shoulder and, for the first time since the banquet, did not argue. "It's not," she whispered. "I don't think it ever was." The men who'd grabbed her were never caught, slipped away into the chaos of the city's lower streets before the guard could close the net. But they hadn't needed to be caught for the truth of who'd sent them to become, finally, undeniable. A length of fine, distinctive cord found discarded near the scene. The kind sold by exactly one merchant in the capital, who kept exactly the kind of careful purchase records merchants of expensive goods always kept, and who confirmed, when pressed, that he had sold 3 lengths of that very cord to a steward from House Calder not 4 days prior. It was not on its own enough to convict a lord. It was enough, finally, to make the council listen. It was enough, more importantly, to make Lord Phineas understand that his careful, patient plan had collapsed entirely, that the woman he'd tried twice now to remove quietly from the world had survived both attempts and, in surviving, had armed an entire court with reasons to look at him instead of her. A cornered man, Dovey had learned by now, did not become more careful. He became more desperate, and desperate men reached for whatever was nearest, however reckless, however final. What was nearest in this case was Dovey herself. The summons came 2 days later, ordinary enough on its surface to nearly slip past her guard entirely. A folded note delivered by an unfamiliar page, requesting, in careful formal script, that the Lady Dovey attend a private audience with several members of House Calder's allied houses, who wished, the note claimed, to hear her account of recent events directly, in the spirit of clearing the air between their families. It was, Dovey understood the moment she read it, almost certainly a trap. It was also, she understood with equal clarity. Possibly the only chance she would ever get to walk into the heart of Phineas's own carefully built support and force the truth out into daylight where the whole court could finally see it. Because a private audience with allied houses, witnessed by enough eyes, could just as easily become a public reckoning if she played it correctly. She did not tell Idris where she was going. She knew with absolute certainty that if she did, he would either forbid it outright or insist on coming himself, and a king storming into a room full of his enemy's allies would turn this into exactly the kind of violent confrontation the realm did not need, and Phineas would happily use against them both. She left a note instead, short, honest, terrified to write but more terrified not to, and slipped out under cover of an ordinary afternoon, escorted only by the 2 guards Idris had assigned her, who did not yet know they were walking her directly into the lion's den. The chamber, when she arrived, was not what the note had promised. There were no allied houses gathered to hear her account. There was only Lord Phineas, standing alone at the far end of a long, shuttered room, his careful, rehearsed smile entirely absent for the first time since Dovey had ever seen his face. "You came alone," he said, sounding almost disappointed, as though he'd hoped for more of a fight. "I came with guards," Dovey said, though even as she spoke she heard the chamber door, close behind her, heard the particular, final click of a lock turning, and understood that the 2 guards who had escorted her here were, in this moment, very much not present to help her. "Guards can be paid," Phineas said simply. "Most things can be paid, Lady Belrose. It's a lesson my family learned generations before yours forgot you ever had a name worth remembering." He moved toward her, slow and unhurried, a man who believed. Still, even now, with the court closing in around him, that he held every advantage in the room. "I want you to understand that none of this was ever personal. You are simply an inconvenient loose thread on a tapestry I have been weaving for 11 years. I would have unraveled you quietly, painlessly, and let the realm forget your name the way it was always going to forget it anyway. The king's poisoning was an accident I have genuinely regretted. But you," his voice hardened, "you, I will not regret at all." Dovey's mind raced, fast and clear, the way it always did when the danger was real enough to burn away every smaller fear. She had no weapon. She had no guards she could trust in this room. She had only what she had always had in every room that had ever underestimated her, the simple, stubborn fact of seeing more than anyone expected her to. "You're going to kill me in a locked room you arranged yourself," she said, "using guards you bribed, on the same day the merchant who sold the cord that nearly took me from a street outside my aunt's house confirmed exactly who bought it. You understand that the council already suspects you. If I disappear now, today, after that confirmation, there will be no question left in anyone's mind." "There will be no question," Phineas agreed, almost gently, "because there will be no you left to raise one. A confession, once the accused is dead, becomes considerably harder to disprove than a confession from someone still breathing to argue against it. I will mourn you publicly, Lady Belrose. I will be devastated. The court is remarkably forgiving of devastated men." He was closer now, close enough that Dovey could see the precise calculation behind his eyes. The total absence of doubt in a man who had planned every contingency except, perhaps, the one currently unfolding 3 corridors away, where a king who had felt his mate's fear once already through a bond neither of them fully understood was about to feel it again. Dovey did the only thing left to do. She screamed, not for help, not a wordless cry of fear, but words clear and deliberate and pitched to carry, because if this was the only moment she had left to be heard by anyone at all, she intended to make certain it counted. "Asford claim. He killed the here to bury it, and he tried to kill me for the same reason, and he paid the guides. At this door to look away while, he does it again." Phineas's hand closed around her throat with a speed that stole the rest of the sentence. But it was already too late for silence. because somewhere beyond that locked door, a king's wolf had gone utterly, violently still, hearing through a bond that the poison had cracked open, and time had only deepened the unmistakable taste of his mate's terror. The door did not simply open, it came apart. What happened next, Dovey would only piece together afterward in fragments, because her own memory of it dissolved into something close to pure white sensation the moment Phineas's grip closed off her air, the door exploding inward in a shower of splintered wood, a black blur moving faster than anything that size had any right to move. And then Phineas's hand was simply gone from her throat, and the Lord of House Calder was on the floor, with a king's massive wolf form standing over him, jaws inches from his throat, a sound rolling out of that huge chest that had nothing left in it of restraint or court manners or careful kingship at all. "Idris," Dovey gasped, her voice raw, her hand at her own throat. "Idris, don't." The wolf's head turned toward her at the sound of his name, ears flat, eyes blazing that same unnatural dark, and for one suspended, terrible moment, Dovey understood she was looking at something that had gone past the reach of reason entirely. A mate's fury with no human restraint left to leash it. "Don't kill him," she said, quieter now, steadier, because some old instinct told her this was a moment that needed calm more than force. "Please, if you kill him now in front of witnesses, with your hands, your teeth, still shaking with rage, the court will never believe it was justice. They'll believe it was a king silencing a rival before the truth could come out. Let him live long enough to be tried. Let everyone hear what he did, from his own confession, in his own voice. That's the only verdict that will actually stick." For a long, agonized moment, the wolf did not move. Phineas lay frozen beneath him, breath coming in short, terrified gasps, and somewhere in the wreckage of the doorway, guards, real guards, the ones who hadn't been bribed, were beginning to spill into the room, drawn by the sound of breaking wood and a king's furious howl. Then, slowly, with visible effort, the wolf stepped back. He shifted in the next breath, human again, breathing hard, and crossed the small distance to Dovey in 2 long strides, gathering her face between both hands with a gentleness that seemed, after the violence of moments before, almost unbearably tender. "You're hurt," he said, thumb tracing the faint red marks already rising on her throat, his ruined 2 dark eyes furious and wrecked all at once. "He hurt you. I'm alive," Dovey said, "because you came." "I will always come," Idris said, low and fierce, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. Both of them shaking, both of them breathing each other in like the room hadn't nearly ended in blood 5 seconds before. "Poison or not, bond or not, I will always, always come." Behind them, the guards were dragging Lord Phineas upright, and the lord who had spent 11 years weaving a quiet, patient murder was finally, publicly, undeniably unraveling, already babbling half-confessions to anyone close enough to hear, the careful mask of rehearsed sympathy gone entirely from his face, replaced by the raw, ugly panic of a man who understood, at last, that he had lost. Dovey did not watch him being led away. She kept her eyes on Idris instead, on his trembling hands and his ruined, devoted eyes, and the desperate, undone way he held her like letting go might finally unmake him after everything that hadn't. It was the first time in the whole, long, frightening, unraveling of the last several weeks that she let herself believe fully, without the careful hedge of doubt she'd kept folded close against her chest since the banquet, that whatever this was between them had never once been the poison talking at all. The council chamber, 3 days later, was packed tighter than Dovey had ever seen it. Every house in attendance, every face turned toward the raised aste where Lord Phineas of House Calder stood stripped of his usual careful composure, flanked by guards, while the full weight of his own confession, extracted under formal questioning and corroborated by a trembling but finally unburdened Tam, was read aloud for the entire realm to hear. The Ashford claim, the buried heir nobody had thought to trace, the poison meant for a quiet death, and the accident that had nearly cost the realm its king instead, the cord, the locked room. 11 years of patient, careful ambition, unraveled in the space of one formal reading. Dovey sat through it with Idris's hand wrapped around hers the entire time, his thumb moving in slow, steady circles against her knuckles, and felt something in her chest finally, quietly settle. Not triumph, exactly, not even relief, but something closer to the particular, hard-won peace of a woman who has spent her whole life being right about quiet things, and unbelieved watching the entire court, finally, undeniably, see what she had seen from the very first moment. "You were the only one who saw it from the start," Idris murmured to her, low, while the council debated Phineas's sentence in voices pitched for formal record rather than private feeling. Every single piece of it, while the rest of us were busy being important. "Nobody believed me," Dovey said. It wasn't bitter. It was simply true, the way most things she said simply were. "I believe you now," Idris said. "I will spend the rest of my life making certain you never again have to be right about something alone, with no one listening." Dovey looked at him then. Really looked. The way she'd learned to look at everything that mattered. Cataloging each small, unrepeatable detail. The way she'd cataloged 100 small truths. Nobody else had bothered to notice. The faint, permanent darkness still ringing his too wide pupils, a mark the poison had left, that no physician expected to ever fully fade. The new scar, thin and pale, along his jaw from a council session gone briefly, furiously physical in the days after Phineas's arrest, when a Calder loyalist had tried, foolishly, to draw a blade in the king's own chamber. The way his whole large, dangerous body went soft and unguarded only, and exactly when it was turned toward her, as if some final wall in him had simply ceased, after everything, to exist at all. "Your eyes never went back," she said softly. "Even now. Even healed." "No," Idris agreed, unbothered. "I don't think they will. I've stopped minding. Every physician who's looked at me says the change is permanent. Mark the poison left behind that nothing will undo." His mouth curved, faint and real. "I find I don't want it undone, in the end. It is the only proof I carry on my own body that the worst night of my life led me to the truest thing in it. Let the court whisper about my eyes for the rest of my reign, if they like. I would rather wear this than ever go back to a man who didn't know you." Dovey's breath caught. She did not look away. It was not, in the end, a fast unraveling of doubt into devotion. Dovey would not have trusted it if it had been. A love that arrived whole and instant after poison and trauma was exactly the kind of thing a careful, watchful woman knew to be suspicious of, no matter how badly some traitorous, long-starved part of her wanted to simply believe. So Idris proved it the slow way, the inconvenient way, exactly as he'd promised in that firelit solar weeks before. He proved it in the small things, mostly. The things a poison-fevered obsession would never have bothered to sustain once the fever broke. He learned, without being told, that she took her tea with too much honey and pretended she didn't. He noticed, the way she'd spent her whole life noticing others, the particular silence she fell into when a room grew too crowded, and without comment, without making a single performance of it, began steering council gatherings toward smaller, quieter configurations whenever he could manage it. He asked her opinion on matters of state, not as a courtesy, but because, 3 separate times in as many months, her quiet observation of some overlooked detail had caught a problem the entire council had missed. He did not, even once in all the slow weeks that followed, stop touching her the way he had since waking from the poison. A hand finding hers in council, his shoulder finding hers by the fire, his whole large body angling, always, instinctively, toward wherever she stood in a room. But it had changed, somewhere in those months, from the desperate, fevered grip of a man afraid she might vanish into the easy, unthinking touch of a man who had simply stopped imagining a version of his life where she wasn't there to reach for. The poison had long since burned out of his blood by the time he finally asked her, On a quiet evening in early autumn, actually kneeling, the Alpha King of Valethorn on both knees on the floor of his own solar, to be his wife in truth and not merely his protected ward. My eyes are the only part of that night still left in me, he said, holding both her hands in his too dark gaze steady and entirely, undeniably his own. Everything else has had months to fade, if it was ever going to. It didn't fade, Dovey. It only grew. I am asking you now with nothing left to blame but myself. Dovey, who had spent 6 years training herself to be unremarkable in 3 months learning, slowly, painfully, to let herself be seen, looked at the most powerful man in the realm, kneeling at her feet with his whole guarded heart laid open in his hands, and said yes before he'd even finished the question. Lord Phineas of House Calder was stripped of his title and exiled to the farthest, coldest reach of the realm's northern holdings, where Dovey understood. From the rare, brief reports that occasionally reached the capital, he lived out his years in a quiet that had nothing of the careful, ambitious calculation left in it that had once defined every breath he took. Tam, the servant boy, was given a position in the royal kitchens with wages enough to lift his mother and sisters out of the lower town entirely. A small mercy that had cost Dovey nothing and changed, by every account that reached her, everything for a family who had never once expected the world to extend them any kindness at all. The Ashford claim, traced finally and properly through Dovey's own quietly buried lineage, was settled not in House Calder's favor but in hers. Land and holdings she had never once expected to inherit. Arriving the same season, she stopped expecting the world to overlook her at all. She married her king in the spring, in a ceremony that drew every house in the realm to witness it, the same court that had once whispered, "Poisoner," behind careful hands now bowing, formally, irreversibly. Before the lesser noblewoman, they had nearly let a patient, ambitious man erase entirely. The child came the following winter, a little girl with her mother's watchful dark eyes, and, the midwife swore, a faint, telling gold ring already visible at the very center of them, the same mark, fainter but undeniably present, that her father's eyes carried in full. Dovey held her, exhausted and aching and entirely, fiercely happy, in the same sick room where Idris had once nearly died, and found that the room no longer smelled of bitter herbs and bottled fear at all. It smelled, now, of wood smoke and lavender and the particular, warm scent of her husband's skin as he knelt beside the bed, with his face pressed close to both of theirs, breathing them both in like a man who had finally fully stopped being afraid that this might still be taken from him. "She has your stubbornness already," he murmured, watching their daughter's small fist close tight around his finger. "Look at her," refusing to let go. "She has your eyes," Dovey said softly, "marked the same way yours are. I wonder if she'll grow up knowing exactly what they mean, the way you and I had to learn it the hard way. I hope she never has to learn it the way we did," Idris said, low, his thumb tracing gentle circles against their daughter's tiny curled hand. "I hope, for her, it's simply love from the very first day. No poison required to crack the wall down. No court whispering her name like an accusation before they ever learn to say it like a blessing." He looked up, found Dovey's eyes, and something in his face went soft in the particular way it only ever did for her. "I hope she grows up already knowing what it took us both nearly dying to learn, that being seen, truly seen, by the right person was never the danger. The danger was always the people who refused to look at all." Dovey, who had spent 6 careful years making herself invisible to survive a world that had taught her visibility was a danger she could not afford, looked down at the small, fierce, gold-ringed eyes of her daughter, a child who would never once have to learn that lesson the hard way, who would grow up in a court that had already, finally, learned to listen to the quiet ones, and felt something in her chest settle into a peace she had never once let herself imagine, back when invisible was the safest thing a woman like her knew how to be. Outside, beyond the tall windows of the royal wing, The first true snow of winter was beginning to fall over Valethorn, soft and silent and entirely unremarkable, the way the truest, most lasting things so often are, overlooked by everyone in a hurry to notice something louder, and treasured, completely, by the very few who finally learned to stop and really look. Idris pressed a slow kiss to Dovey's temple, then to their daughter's small dark head, and said nothing at all for a long, warm while, because some moments, the truest ones, never needed a single word to prove what they already were. And that, dear listener, is where we leave them. Not at the grand, dramatic ending the court once expected, but at something quieter and far more lasting. A king who learned that love proven slowly is worth more than love declared in a single desperate breath, and a woman who learned, at last, that being truly seen was never the danger she'd spent her whole life guarding against. If this story found something in you tonight, if you ached the way I hoped you would, stay a while longer. There are more nights like this one waiting, more quiet women who notice everything, more dangerous men who finally, look. I'll be here when you're ready for the next one.